Hello, everybody. Welcome to the weekly Warnell Seminar. I'm Bynum Bowl. I'm professor of Parks and Recreation Tourism Program. Love the Warnell Seminar because we have so many different disciplines represented here in Warnell, and it's a chance to kind of take a break from what you're doing in your own silo, see other folks, get to learn about something cool like forest history. During the class, make sure you mark that you're present. Just pass this around, and also make sure that you're doing. I can't remember, it's 2 or 3 reflections on ELC. 3, thank you. Excited about our seminar speaker today. It's Dr. Tania Munz. Dr. Munz is the president of the Forest History Society, which is in Durham, North Carolina. The Forest History Society focuses on forest and conservation history. It's a donor-supported independent archive and library in Durham. So before joining the Forest History Society, Dr. Munz held leadership roles at the National Humanities Center, the Linda Hall Library, and most recently, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we're excited to have Dr. Munz here. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Bynum, for that introduction and for inviting me. Thanks to Bob Isler for making the introduction. And I want to thank all the faculty members who have met with me over the last couple of days. It's been fantastic to hear about your research and interest. And thanks to all of you for being here. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. So if I flag, just tell me to speak more loudly. All right. Well, Bynum, you cut to the chase of some of the things I was gonna say about my background. So I can skip over that. I just, to give a little bit more context, it's a little bit, maybe it's not obvious how somebody ends up at a Forest History Society. My training was in history of science. So I did a PhD in history and I worked on the history of animal behavior studies. And I actually ended up writing a book about Carl von Frisch, who was the researcher who discovered honeybee communication. And he did it during World War II it's a very interesting story. He did it with funding from the Nazi Ministry of Food and Agriculture after he had been found to be a quarter Jewish. And then in 1973, he won a Nobel Prize for that work. So it's a very interesting sort of political story. But anyway, so that's my background and that was sort of my interest. And then I used to teach environmental history. So that was kind of my connection. The Forest History Society, as Bynum mentioned, does forest and conservation history. So in terms of content and my interest, that was kind of the tie-in. And then I was in leadership roles at various not-for-profits. The Linda Hall Library is a big science and engineering and technology library. So I got exposure to the library and archive, and then various other positions. The Academy was a bit more policy focused, which is something I'm interested in, and was a really broad array of work that we did in global security, international affairs, science, engineering, technology, the arts. Like it was a pretty heterogeneous portfolio of work. And then the job came up at the Forest History Society, and I just couldn't believe that there was a position at an institution that had so many of the things that I was interested in and so many of the stuff that I had done before. And also, I think this is always important, and some of you are earlier in your careers, it had a lot of things that I actually was just interested in learning more about. So it's not that you always bring the full skill set to your jobs. It's also sometimes you make these decisions and you just think, okay, I want to learn more about it. That's what kind of made me go for it at various stages. So I'm going to talk a little bit to give you an introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Forest History Society. How many of you have heard of the Forest or had heard of the Forest History Society? Okay, awesome. Your faculty has heard, which is great. So that's a picture of the Forest History Society at night. It's a very sort of pretty, moody picture. It's a new building that the organization moved into in 2019. I should say this is before my time. I started just over a year ago. So I started in September of last year. But that's the new building. Here you can see the lobby space, and we have exhibit space. Here you can see an old Smokey Bear costume in our exhibit case. And here is the reading room, and you can see we have mass timber in the ceiling, and I know that's of interest to this crowd. It's a beautiful, airy building. It's incredibly thoughtfully put together. So it's just a real joy to be in this building. And the thing that I find very comforting from the time I've spent in libraries and archives is that we now in this building have really state-of-the-art archival space. So we have a really good fire suppression system. We have really excellent moisture, temperature controls. That is the piece that you're not seeing here, but that's what keeps all of the documents safe for long-term storage. So altogether, the building has increased to over 16,000 square feet. So we have a sizable space now, and we're right next to Duke University's West Campus. So it's a terrific location as well. This is our team. We are a small but mighty team of 7 people, including myself. And we have administrative and financial staff, and we have library, archive, and a historian on staff as well. And I'm gonna, throughout this talk, make a bit of a pitch for coming to use or using our services remotely. And our library, archive, and reference staff are really terrific, and they help lots of people, either remotely or people who come in person. So when I arrived at FHS, in addition to the new building that you just saw, it also had a very robust new strategic plan that had been developed. And it's a 10-year plan that really focuses on strategically building our collections, growing our programming, and raising our visibility, and also on fundraising to support those excellent activities, and foundationally on providing really excellent governance. And that's what our board, there's our former board chair, current board member, has really been focusing on as well. So there was a lot that was in place that sort of made it a very nice entry into this position. To give you a little bit of background, so this is all kind of recent history. The Forest History Society was founded in 1946, so just right after World War II. And it was founded with a gift from the Weyerhaeuser family. And we continue to receive support from Weyerhaeuser family members, with Weyerhaeuser family members who are still to this day on our board. So that's a long-standing relationship that we've had with that family. And it also gives you a sense of part of our interest in terms of our collections. I'll talk to you a little bit about what we do. Our mission is to preserve and help people use the documents of forest history. The Forest History Society identifies, collects, interprets, and disseminates historical information on the relationship of humans and forests, contributing to informed natural resource decision-making. So the idea is that we keep history safe, we learn from the past, and we do it also in terms of how we make decisions today. So what does that mean? What is it that we actually do? We collect materials, we make them accessible, so that means processing, digitizing, answering reference questions. We interpret forest and conservation history, we publish books, documents, and oral histories. We promote scholarship, so we also offer prizes and fellowships. We offer a travel fellowship so people can come and use our collections. We also offer a graduate student fellowship. So this is for a graduate student who is, it doesn't have to be somebody in history, but somebody whose project has a historical emphasis. And we offer, I was asked about this yesterday, we offer $15,000 a year for grad students. It's actually a very nice fellowship. And then we offer article prizes as well. We are co-publishers of environmental history, the kind of flagship journal of the field. And we do that together with the American Society of Environmental History, and University of Chicago Press is our publisher. And then I already mentioned we publish books, and we publish a magazine called Forest History Today. At the moment, we publish it roughly annually, but that's a very nice kind of thick magazine that talks about different aspects of forest and conservation history. And it does it in a very accessible, kind of short, fun, illustrated articles. And then we do outreach. We do a monthly podcast, we have a blog, and we do social media, as you would probably expect. Here is a picture. I'm going to talk a little bit about our collections now. The collections are really at the heart of everything. So you saw a bunch of activities, but the collection is really at the heart of what we do. On the left, you can see our archival space that I was mentioning. And it's actually the Weyerhaeuser collection that you see, that's our biggest collection. And on the right, you see our oldest book. This is John Evelyn's Silva. It was published in 1664 by the Royal Society of London. And it is actually the first book that the Royal Society of London published. So the first book that they published was on telling English landowners to replant trees, right? And if you think about, we talked a little bit about this a bunch, if you think about England being an island nation where the Navy was super important, you needed tall trees for masts, and you needed oak trees for your hulls, for your ships. This was critically important, not just for your economy, but also for your national security. So this was a 17th century interest. And the book is really beautiful, right? If you think about this book from the 17th century that's now in Durham, North Carolina, it's really important for that book to be in good climate controlled, a good climate controlled environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the collection. We have over 200 individual collections. I mentioned the Weyerhaeuser collection, that is the largest collection. We have other private industry collection, West Maple, International Paper. We have nonprofits, NGOs, and associations. So the second largest collection is the Society of American Foresters collection. For those of you going to SAF next week, we have those papers. And as you may know, SAF next year is going to have its 125th anniversary. So it's a really beautiful history of how the field of forestry has changed and has evolved. We also have a reference collection from the Forest Service that's very interesting and useful to researchers. Our library is over 10,000 books. We have an oral history program, and what's amazing about that program is it started, so we were founded in 1946. Already in the early 50s, the Forest History Society started to collect testimonies from people who were making big decisions, who were in companies, who were experts in logging, in forestry, and we have that collection. So that's a very nice source. We have over 40,000 images that are digitized, and they have pretty good metadata, so you can do searches if you're interested in a particular topic. For those of you who are teaching as well, or if you're giving a presentation, you can search online for those images. And then we have a few objects. That's sort of not our main focus, but we also have some objects, including some lantern slides. Those are those old-fashioned slides that faculty used to use that are printed on glass and hand-tinted and show sort of old logging practices that are kind of lovely. And then we have some equipment and we have some paintings. All right. But, and I say this as a historian, for me, it is super important that we keep these records safe. And at the same time, I also think it's not enough, right? It's not enough to just keep things in a climate controlled vault. So, for this talk, what I want to do is to talk to you about 3 users who have recently come to the Forest History Society to give you a sense of how people use our collections. And I've sort of divided up into 3 kinds of ways that they're using it. The first is understanding our past. The second is connecting to the present. And the third is about building the future. Here is the first researcher. On the left is Norm Johnson. On the right is Art Cooper. Norm Johnson came to the Forest History Society in February with his wife, Debbie, and they wanted to do research on the creation of the National Forest Management Act. I'll talk about that in a moment. So in history, I think an easy question is always what happened, right? This is sort of the mind-numbing high school history that you sometimes get. It's like that this happened, then this happened, then okay. The more interesting questions, of course, are about how did it happen, right? Like how did these, there's nothing obvious about how history unfolds. And the deeper you get, the more you realize how contingent it really is. So how did it happen? And then the even more interesting question, I think, is why something happened. And these are the kinds of questions that Norm is interested in. For a little bit of background, Norm is a retired professor of forestry and resources in the College of Forestry at Oregon State. As I learned from Jesse last night, he was actually Jesse's professor at Oregon State.
Theater's class.
He is class. He is known for having developed Floor Plan, which is a linear programming based harvest scheduling model. Those of you who may know this, this is new to me, but this is something that he developed that helped estimate how to do harvests, schedules and quantities, and that was pretty pivotal, is my understanding, in forest planning analysis. So he came in February to research the National Forest Management Act that was passed in 1976 and really had profound consequences, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Art Cooper on the right was a longtime faculty member at NC State, and he actually ended up donating his papers to the Forest History Society. So that's also a source of papers that we get of people who are leaders in their field who want their papers to be kept and to be made available for future researchers. And, you know, they could give it to their home universities, but I think some people really love the idea of having their papers be in a collection with other forestry collections. And we're kind of a smaller organization that really takes care of these papers and really promotes it for research. So Art Cooper was at NC State, and he was also the chair of the Committee of Scientists, and I'll talk more about that when I talk about that 1976 legislation. And so Norm and Art met up with each other when Norm came to do research, and I just think that's a very adorable picture. All right, so these are the papers that Norm Johnson looked at. So Art Cooper, there he is again. These were his papers, and as you'll deduce, the dates are not living dates, but they're the dates of the collections that we have. So these are the materials. The earliest piece of his work is from 1967, and the last piece, and that's probably when he gave us the collection, is from 2002. He also looked at the Robert Wolf papers, and those dates are 1897 to 2005, and the Forest Service reference collection. Wolf was a professional forester and forest policy analyst in Washington, D.C., whose career spanned 45 years with the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of the Budget, the U.S. Senate, and the Congressional Research Service. So he had a very distinguished career as well. And the final I already mentioned, he looked at the Forest Service pieces. All right. So let me say a little bit about what Norm Johnson was interested in when it came to the National Forest Management Act. So one piece is that act had in its phrasing to provide for the diversity of plant and animal communities based on the suitability and capability of the specific land area in order to meet overall multiple use objectives. And this is what came to be known as the diversity clause in its interpretation. So according to Norm Johnson, this multiple use objective meant that the Forest Service was not just supposed to focus on timber. It was reaffirming that it was supposed to focus on sustained yield, yes, but also on multiple use. And this was a shift. This was not the first legislation that asked for multiple use, but this was sort of reaffirming that it wasn't just about timber, but it was about other species, animals in the area as well. The second aspect that Norm Johnson was interested in was this idea that this legislation had written into it that there needed to be a group of scientists to help the Department of Agriculture interpret how to do this legislation. So the planning was supposed to rely on this committee of scientists, and they were not Forest Service employees. So one question, and this he found this in the Art Cooper papers when he was doing research. Was that, well, Art Cooper was part of the committee of scientists. He was a wildlife biologist, and William Webb was a wildlife biologist with a specialty in ornithology. So this legislation seemed to be asking to secure multiple use objectives and sustain yield. And the committee of scientists was charged with figuring out how to do that. So what did that mean? And how was that to be accomplished? And this really was going to be asking for quite a bit of rethinking on how forest planning happened. So they came up with what came to be known as the viability rule. And this rule said that there had to be habitat for viable populations of native vertebrates in the planning area. And Jack Ward Thomas, who was part of the group that came up with the Northwest Forest Management Plan, he also became the chief of the Forest Service. He had the following to say about the diversity rule. And this is something from our collections, where Jack Ward Thomas was being interviewed by Pete Steen. Pete Steen was the president of the Forest History Society, a couple of people before me. So Pete Steen was talking to him about the change in emphasis of the Forest Service from range and timber to focusing more on wildlife. And this is in the early 70s. So Pete Steen says, was that some sort of response to the Endangered Species Act? And Jack Ward Thomas said no. And Steen said, because 1973 was the Endangered Species Act. And Thomas says, Endangered Species Act still wasn't grabbing the Forest Service attention quite yet. What was focusing attention on was a wildlife diversity clause in the regulations issued pursuant to the National Forest Management Act. And he said you could write a textbook about how an obscure clause in regulations shook the agency. And that's in fact what Norm Johnson is doing, right? He is writing this particular textbook. And he went on to say they, meaning the scientists, wrote the diversity clause, which says that all native desirable non-native species should be maintained in viable conditions and well distributed within the planning area. Many people think that the Endangered Species Act had the most impact on the Forest Service. Not so. It has been that diversity clause. And then Steen asks, so was there immediate litigation? And Thomas says, nope, it just kind of lay there like a booby trap. He says the thing that brought the Forest Service to grips with spotted owls was not the Endangered Species Act per se. The species wasn't listed until we got through with the Interagency Scientific Committee ISC report that focused in part on the spotted owl. The IEC's establishment of the word was driven by the need to comply with the viability clause. So this is the former chief of the Forest Service. There it is, which I'm sure you all recognize. So this rule and this interpretation of the legislation ended up being very consequential. So what Norm Johnson wanted to find out is how did this come about? How were these decisions made? What was sort of the thinking behind it of the people that were involved? So I mentioned William Webb was the wildlife biologist. This is mostly from the Art Cooper papers. There are letters between Webb and Art Cooper. So what he found is that William Webb realized during his work that the National Forest Management Act intended that planning start with the assumption that all resources are of equal value. He then was very dismayed that the economists who talked to the Committee of Scientists assumed the planning started with maximizing timber production, and then other resource considerations such as wildlife would be assessed in terms of how much they reduce timber production. And remember, this is not a biologist from the Forest Service. This is an outside wildlife biologist, Webb. And Webb struggled to create a substantive standard from the NFMA language requiring, quote, the diversity of plant and animals to meet multiple use objectives that would put wildlife on equal footing with timber. Norm Johnson could tell from FHS files that Webb struggled and that they sort of wrote back and forth and tried to sort out how to do this. And then eventually they settled on this viability rule as a way to bring wildlife on equal footing with timber considerations. And here's what's important. And I think this is really what oral histories and letters, and sometimes if you have access to them, diaries, these are the kinds of sources that will yield this kind of information. What Norm Johnson found was that this actually happened in a fairly uncontroversial way. And that the Committee on Scientists really trusted each other, worked well with each other, and they really listened to to Webb on this recommendation. So Webb sort of in these letters was trying to sort it out and call for this viability rule that it be well distributed, and other people with more or less very little controversy accepted it. So in 1979, the recommendations of the NFMA were accepted and the committee was disbanded. After this happened, again, this is found in the letters. This is what Norm Johnson found. Webb felt that that after they issued the viability rule, more was needed. Some Forest Service biologists he was in contact with came to a similar conclusion. But he really felt like they had not gone far enough and that more was needed. And then the Reagan administration would bring them all back together. And this is also very interesting. I think in the 70s, you get this legislation like with NEPA and with the NFMA, where things are really opened up to sort of public input and much more discussion in lawmaking. And the Reagan administration decided to open this legislation up again to see if there was too much regulatory burden on the agency. And they reconvened this committee of scientists, although they didn't call it the committee of scientists anymore, but they brought them back together as a panel of experts and had them relook at the NFMA. And the interesting thing there is that it wasn't just anymore that timber and animals were to be on equal footing, but at that point, Webb introduced this idea that they also needed to be well distributed. So that it was not enough to have viable populations in certain pockets of the planning area, but in fact, that they needed to be well distributed throughout the area. And this is where later, I think the issue with the northern spotted owl really came to a head, right? And it was, the first part of it was that owls are as important as timber, and in this case, especially old growth timber. And then this well-distributed clause ensured, and these owls have really broad ranges, as you guys probably know. So it wasn't just that they had to be viable, but the population had to be distributed. And of course, this issue with the northern spotted owl had massive consequences. It had consequences for how people thought about the environment. It had consequences for how people thought about science and politics. And it had huge consequences for entire communities that had been dependent on logging for generations. So huge, huge consequences. So I talked to Norm Johnson about how Forest History Society's papers helped him uncover kind of the story. I mean, this really is sort of looking a bit more at the sausage making behind the legislation and how he was able to use our sources. And he actually ended up writing us a little bit of a blurb about our collection. And here's what he writes. I was able to discover buried gems in correspondence between Art Cooper and wildlife biologist William Webb that has never been recorded into the public history before. This is big, exclamation mark. I'm excited to put it into our new book. And then he goes on. The materials of the Forest History Society are a veritable treasure trove for anyone researching forest topics. The records held there are part of the historic record at a crucial time in forest land policy development. These records will continue to inform the research that is performed by scientists, scholars, and forestry professionals now and into the future. Policies and plans will always need to be revised, and new forest-related topics will come to surface, whether it's climate change, wildlife, timber, and beyond. And the truth of it is this: policies reflect the passions of people, and that is what you find in the papers held at FHS. Using the records held at FHS to bring history to life. So he wrote us like really a fantastic work. Yeah. And really, he argues the Forest Service has really never been the same. So why does this matter? Why do we care, right? One of the first blurbs is connecting to the past. I think part of what it does is that it gives us a sense that often very consequential events can come down to, yes, politics, yes, the science, yes, precedent and other regulations, but it also has a lot to do with individuals, with relationships, with the kinds of decisions that people make together. And that, I think, is very important for understanding how lawmaking happens, right? And how decision-making happens, that it often is about individuals, about temperaments, about whether or not people get along. And that's the kind of thing that can be found in oral histories and certainly in letters. So that's, I think it gives us a real glimpse for how these kinds of things come about. All right. I'm going to introduce you to our next researcher. This woman's name is Xing Kaur, and she really brought a different set of questions, or she ended up finding answers to a different set of questions than Warren Johnson. She's earlier career, the questions that she really thought about is sort of, who am I, where and how do I belong, and how does the present make sense to me? And I'll explain it a little bit more in a moment. Xing is a graphic artist, an illustrator, and builder. And when she came to the Forest History Society, she was working on a book that dealt with Paul Bunyan, except for it was kind of a reinterpretation. And it was this Chinese mythical figure, Auntie Po, who was part of a Chinese logging camp. And sort of many of the elements of Paul Bunyan were found, but it was Auntie Po who was the figure. And part of what she wanted to do was to bring back the history of the role of Chinese immigrants in logging communities. And the collection that she looked at is the William Lowhead collection that we have. And the years of that collection are 1897 to 58. You can see it's 61 years. Like, this is a really massive collection. So we have basically some of his teenage materials all the way to his late career. Now, he was a logger in the West and ended up working for Red River Lumber Company in California. He was always a hobby artist. So alongside doing sort of his day job, he always drew and illustrated. And he ended up actually working in the marketing department of Red River Lumber Company and ended up being their marketing manager. And his claim to fame is that he sort of pulled Paul Bunyan from this obscure mythical figure that was sort of in logging areas of the United States and really made him kind of a household name. So this Paul Bunyan that you recognize there on the upper right is a sketch of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Ox. That is largely due to William Lowhead's work for Red River Lumber Company, his advertising work. And the collection that we have is amazing. I mean, we have drawings and sketches. We have some of the marketing materials. We have correspondence. You don't have to read this. We have his letters. It's just like a really, really cool. And we also have some of his oil paintings actually that we had hanging in the building, and they're totally fabulous. But it's a remarkable collection in that it really sort of charts his career. And so this is what Xing was interested in, and she sort of spent time in his papers. And one of the things she was looking at was in this letter, and what had happened is William Lowhead was really, as I mentioned, like art was really kind of his hobby, although he turned it into his career. But he was sort of a hobby artist, and he later in his life, later in his career, painted some oil paintings of logging communities and logging scenes. He ended up sending those to Robert Tyler Davis, and that's where the second page is, where he sent a response to him. Davis was the director of the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon, and he asked him for some advice. So what he wanted was for a professional to give him some pointers, to look at these oil paintings and give him a little bit of a critique. And so here is the second page, and I'm gonna just read you some excerpts, but again, you don't actually have to follow. But he said, this is from earlier, please accept my thanks for your criticism of my paintings relayed to me by Ed. This is the first advice I've had from a competent critic. Ed's statement was written in rather general terms. I had the impression that due to his friendly consideration, he had toned it down a bit, and that you thought the pictures were pretty bad. I'm not surprised or disappointed, and your judgment was about what I expected. I may as well confess what you already know. I am not an artist, and will never be an artist, for I don't think like an artist. I think like a storyteller, and will be satisfied if I can document some subjects from a life that is passing and forest settings that are also disappearing that will meet the approval of woodsmen and a public, and then he writes in parentheses, lowbrows like myself, who are interested in such things. I know that artists have a very low opinion, and this is sort of the top of this page. I know that artists have a very low opinion of delineators and illustrators, but the artist knows a lot of things that I do not know. Maybe advice from an artist could help me reach a compromise that will tone down some of my worst faults. I mean, it's sort of heartbreaking. Here I'm trying to preserve as much technical detail as possible. I'm skipping a little bit of a bygone period for readers who are critical of such details, but not very particular about the art. Surely I could do both if I were a better draftsman. So Shinkor was doing research, and she really found a lot of aspects in Lauhead's work that kind of resonated with her. It was a shared interest. She is very interested in Paul Bunyan, and clearly Lauhead was very interested in Paul Bunyan. It was being an artist, but it was also about kind of the process. So it's very interesting, like she does these kind of character studies, and she found like very similar drawings in his materials. So similarity that she recognized in process, but also, and this is what she talked about, right? This is a woman who is separated by almost 100 years from a very different background, and yet found a kind of kinship also in some of the doubts that he had about his career, right? He's somebody who ended up having a very successful advertising career, left a pretty incredible legacy, but here he was feeling like, I'm not really an artist. I know that this is no good, and sort of had this kind of vulnerability and self-doubt that she actually really felt was very comforting, and she was really able to connect with. So this is another way that somebody connected with the FHS collection. And here, this is the cover of her book. It's totally great. I recommend it to all of you. And in her inscription, she wrote for the Forest History Society, thank you for letting me be a Paul Bunyan nerd in your library. The last person I'm going to introduce you to is Andy Kolarova, who you see here on the right-hand side. She graduated from Duke in May of 2020. Not a good time to graduate, all right. And surprise, she was having a hard time finding full-time employment. And at Duke, she got a degree in environmental sciences and was super passionate about animals and very sort of pro-environment, and that's what she wanted to go into. She couldn't find a job in that, so then she decided to work for AmeriCorps. And while she was working, while she was with AmeriCorps, they placed her in West Virginia in one of the national parks, working on the eastern hemlock. And she sort of described that it was kind of miserable conditions. She was in a tent. I feel like all of you can probably relate to this, for days and weeks on end. Sometimes she was cold, sometimes she was hot. But she looked at eastern hemlock and looked at the pest, the name of which I forget, we were just talking about this bill. And kind of realized that she woke up every morning, as she describes, with kind of a smile on her face, and that this actually made her super happy. So her supervisor at the time said, you know what, I think you might be interested in becoming a forester. She's like, no, I'm all about the environment. I don't want to cut trees, so on and so forth. And then the more she thought about it, she thought, I want to learn more about this. So she
Googled, was on break from AmeriCorps, and she Googled how to become a forester in Durham, North Carolina. And shockingly came up with the Forest History Society, and then contacted Steve Anderson, who was my predecessor, and said, hey, I'm interested in forestry. I have a break in my AmeriCorps assignment. Can I come do some volunteer work? She came as an intern. We were so lucky. She came twice. And she worked on two collections, the Overlander collection and the Weyerhaeuser collection. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what she did and found. And here you can see the Weyerhaeuser company records are super massive, and the Overlander Trust, she sort of used different sources to piece that together. All right. So this is an image from the Overlander collection. The Overlander collection is named after Gustav Oberlander, who was a German immigrant who made his fortune in the hosiery industry. You guys know about this. I see some head nodding. He gave $1 million to promote American-German exchange in 1931 for the purposes of promoting public welfare. And one of the areas that he identified as being an essential element of public welfare was forestry. So altogether, from 1934 to 1938, there were two kind of groups of Germans who came to the US, and then 3 trips of Americans going to Germany to learn from one another, to look at different forestry sites, different forest product sites. They had dinners and meals together. They got to sort of see how people interacted with the forest in the countryside, like just kind of very substantive cultural and professional exchanges through these trips. You may recognize the second person from the left is Aldo Leopold. He went on one of these expeditions in 1935 to look at German forestry. Did not have a super positive impression of German forest, but was part of this exchange. So as you think about that time period of 1934 to 1938, and you think about sort of German and American friendship building efforts, this is of course a problematic time to be doing this kind of work. Hitler rose to power in 1933. This relationship ended in 1938, a little bit before. Austria was annexed, and then in 1939, of course, the Germans would invade Poland, right? But during this period, tensions were rising. It was clear that the Germans were violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, like things were starting to build up. So this is a complicated history, and Andy did a beautiful job of writing a digital exhibit for us, and I encourage you to look at it on our website that really talks about some of the things that they were concerned about. It uses some of the images. We have really interesting images from this collection. I'll show you a few more, but that also sort of talks about the politics behind it. So a really nice nuanced look at these exchanges. And you can see here, they're visiting, so they visited forest like in Germany and Austria. They also went to Czechoslovakia. So they kind of went around the area. Here you can see a flume, and you can see very German fashion, like beautifully stacked. At the end of it, you can see the logs, very orderly. Here, I mean, this is kind of what Aldo Leopold talked about. He's like, the German forests are like super geometrical, and they really went totally overboard, and everything looks incredibly precise. And he really sort of was, I think, almost like aesthetically offended by how well managed or how aggressively managed the forests were. But here's a plantation, and here you can see are some of the Austrian delegation they met with. So these photos are really totally period in the collection. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So one of the things when I talked to Andy before coming here to try to get a little bit of a sense again of kind of what she learned from doing this internship, because it's sort of, you know, for somebody wanting to be a forester, it's not totally obvious why you would go come intern at the Forest History Society. So I was curious. And she said that it really helped her kind of get a sense of history and sort of understand what different people at different times cared about. You know, they, as I mentioned, it was about forest products, forest management, about water management. So it was really a diverse set of topics. And she also said that she even learned like a lot of technical terms from doing the research in this collection. So then Andy went to, in fact, study forestry at Duke, and she was doing her degree. And then when she graduated from Duke, she once again didn't have a job quite lined up. So she contacted us again and said, do you have any work for me? We were delighted to have her back. And she worked on the Weyerhaeuser advertising collection. So this collection is massive, as I mentioned, has tons of photographs. Here's a picture of women working at Weyerhaeuser during World War II. You've probably seen pictures of Rosie the Riveter, like "We need you," the men are fighting the war. And Weyerhaeuser had in its newsletters, in its kind of publicity materials, sort of had these women who were working, these Paula Bunyan's working in their facilities. And from the 50s, here's Alda Leopold again. This is still Weyerhaeuser. You can see how different the kind of publicity look is. There's sort of a very, on the one hand, you have a cut behind Alda Leopold, but he's still sort of communing with nature and feeding little deer while the doe is looking on in the distance. And this is one of my total favorites. This is a record that we have in the collection. This is from the 60s, and it has that total Mad Men look about it. And it is actually different musical tracks that should help people sell the Weyerhaeuser hardwood paneling too. So Andy worked on this collection and did a lot of scanning, processing of these totally fabulous materials. Again, I asked her, you know, what was it like? Like, what did you get out of it? And she said that it was helpful for her to see how the industry has evolved. And I just to kind of take the punchline away, she is actually working at Weyerhaeuser now. So she did end up getting a job, and her first job out of forestry school is at Weyerhaeuser. So she felt like seeing, even though she understands that these are publicity materials, and it is always, of course, the company's intention to put its best foot forward, she felt like seeing their evolution sort of helped her understand how there is continuous learning, and feels very much that is still the culture. Like, yes, we're going to change our mind about some of the things that we're doing, but there certainly has been an evolution in the kinds of things that we care about and the ways in which we do it. So that was one thing. And then I asked her if she feels that knowing history makes her a better forester. And she sort of paused and said, she feels that history, because as she described, she feels like forestry is a bit of an art and a bit of a science, and having a sense of history kind of helps her understand that she has inherited some of the decisions that people have made before. And of course, some of the decisions she makes will be inherited by people who come after her. So very much sort of thinking about the future as she's making decisions. So I thought that was a really lovely and very kind of thoughtful response that I got from her. All right. So I'm gonna wrap up here. I know that we want to have a little bit of time for questions. I guess what I've tried to show you is how people bring these different kinds of questions and different kinds of motivations to our collections. And over time, the questions we have as a society, of course, change, right? Our interests in history really change, but our collections really come to life through the people who use them and the people who teach us about what we have, and our reference tells them about things that we have, but we really sort of get a sense of what the value is of the things that we keep. I welcome any questions. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have ideas for things that you would like the Forest History Society to do, or you have reflections on how history matters to you, I would also love to hear about that. So thank you.